Fear arrived as vibration before it had a name. Floors, windshields, glasses in kitchen cabinets all trembled a half-second after the first strikes. In San Diego, people stepped out in work shoes and pajamas and saw the harbor under a low belt of smoke. A missile had torn through a communications hub near the port. The sound moved inland in one flat sheet, louder than thunder, shorter than an earthquake. Car alarms flared, died, and left the faint hiss of burning fuel. In Norfolk, the shock came as a slow shove through old brick near the naval piers. Somewhere close to satellite links and pier infrastructure, another hit bent window frames and rattled dishes. A 68-year-old woman sat down in her hallway, flip phone in hand, watching signal bars while every call to her son failed. Across Puget Sound, a tight flash marked an impact near facilities tied into undersea cables. The delayed crack reached ferry decks and cul-de-sacs seconds later. On the Tacoma Narrows Bridge, traffic rolled to a stop behind a pickup whose driver stood in the lane, staring at the new column of smoke. In Sacramento, a 57-year-old mechanic saw a distant flare near the airbase and felt his shop light stutter. The grid caught, lost, then caught again as load shifted while his small radio coughed broken phrases through static. Impact confirmed, unknown damage to multiple nodes. Elsewhere, the power did not return. Sections of the Houston Energy Corridor dimmed in sequence as substations and control systems went offline under combined hits and cyber interference. In New York, some blocks blinked and held, others went dark and stayed that way. A few hospital generators started at once. Others needed long seconds while alarms shrieked in ICU corridors. Phones lit and failed in the same motion. Networks jammed under the weight of calls and alerts. GPS displays froze or drifted, icons sliding off roads that still lay where they always had. Guidance arrived in short, conflicting bursts. One FEMA crawl on local TV read "Seek shelter." A DHS bulletin on radio said "Shelter in place." Other channels offered a flat line, DEFCON posture adjusted, with no detail. Miles from the harbor in San Diego, air raid sirens rose, long, climbing tones triggered by heat and smoke near the burning port. The system did not distinguish between docks and quiet streets. Families who had heard the explosion only as a dull thud now took the siren as proof of a second strike. Some stepped onto lawns, then backed away. Others went into basements they rarely used, arms full of water, pills, flashlights. On freeways outside Denver, cars eased onto shoulders. Drivers stood by open doors, staring at an ordinary sky. From more than one airfield, a new sound thickened the air, aircraft climbing in measured intervals, engines drawing a vibration over suburbs and fields. Instinct pulled people's heads down and shoulders up. For the second time that day, the country held still. The hours after the first strikes did not bring clarity. They brought lines. By late morning, hospital parking lots from San Diego to Norfolk were full of cars left at odd angles. Inside, corridors ran on generator light, a flat yellow that made faces look older. Some wards had power, others stayed dark, staff moving with flashlights between them. Monitors beeped, then reset, then held. Every few minutes someone asked, "Any updates?" and got the same small shake of the head. At gas stations outside Denver and along the Gulf Coast, vehicles formed narrow columns that reached back onto feeder roads. Engines were mostly off to save fuel. People stood beside open doors, phones in their hands. The signal bars rose and fell as the network staggered under the load of millions trying to call at once. Texts arrived out of order. Voicemails stacked up without timestamps. Supermarkets filled but not with noise. Shoppers pushed half-loaded carts slowly, pausing at aisles for water, canned food, dry goods. Very few spoke. Overhead TVs played local news on mute, closed captions scrambling words from FEMA and DHS. Seek shelter, remain indoors, no confirmation of additional strikes. The contradictions sat side by side on different channels. On bridges over the Mississippi near St. Louis and Memphis, traffic slowed to a crawl. Eastbound and westbound lanes both packed as families tried to close distance, parents moving toward children, adult children driving back toward aging parents. Nobody knew which side of the river felt safer. Drivers tuned radios, but most stations carried only music or garbled bulletins. A few glanced up at the water below, steady and indifferent. Around midday, a DHS statement finally cut through on several networks at once. The tone was calm, the language rehearsed, damage assessments ongoing, government functioning, no nuclear detonations reported. For a moment, shoulders loosened in waiting rooms and kitchens. Then the audio broke on the words, We ask all citizens to, replaced by a hard crackle that didn't end. The empty clause hung heavier than any order. On the Midwest Plains, several small cities received an alert on phones and local radio. Possible follow-on strike, proceed to shelter. Sirens sounded in 2 counties, sending people into basements, school gyms, church halls. Minutes later, another message arrived calling it an error. By then, hundreds were already under cinder-block ceilings, counting breaths, not trusting either version. Across the country, queues became the first real pattern. Lines at pumps, at pharmacy counters, at ATM machines that might or might not still work. People stayed in them, not because they believed in the outcome, but because the act of standing together felt like the only clear instruction left. Night took hold before the country realized how dark it would become. The grid had been weakening all afternoon. By the 14th hour, large sections of New York, Atlanta, Detroit, and parts of the Midwest fell into uneven shadows. Some blocks had power for minutes at a time. Others glowed only from candles and battery lamps pressed against windowsills. Generators rumbled like distant storms. In hospitals, the sound became a floor-wide heartbeat, steady in some wings, faltering in others. When a generator in a Detroit ICU sputtered and dropped half its load, nurses moved patients by flashlight, 4s held overhead, repeating to each other, "It's coming back, it's coming back," even when they didn't believe it. Traffic hardened into static lines across major cities. With no functioning signals, intersections locked up as cars nudged forward and stopped again. Drivers leaned out windows, exchanging brief gestures in the dim. No one honked. The tension was too dense, the air too thin. Engines cut off to save fuel, leaving long avenues coated in mechanical quiet. Across neighborhoods, curtains closed in near unison. People moved the same way without speaking, turning off unnecessary lights, checking radios, testing batteries, pulling children away from windows. Entire blocks acted as though they had agreed to dim themselves, to avoid drawing attention from a threat none of them could see. A 45-year-old engineer in Texas sat in a basement with 6 neighbors. Their only light came from a small radio display glowing pale green. It caught pieces of national broadcast, NORAD, anomalous activity, and then static. Someone whispered, "Stay low," though no one knew why. Shoes scraped lightly on concrete as they shifted, listening for the next break in the noise. In Atlanta, a 63-year-old woman searched for her inhaler by the beam of her dying phone. Every few seconds she paused, hearing something outside, a distant siren, a neighbor's door, or perhaps nothing at all. The line between external sounds and imagined ones blurred in the dark. Farther north, people climbed to rooftops despite warnings, hoping the open air would offer answers. They saw the same thing everywhere, a skyline without definition, a mix of half-lit towers and blank silhouettes. Above it, a low, steady hum brushed the night. 4 minutes at a time, it sounded like approaching aircraft, but no shapes crossed the sky. When the hum faded, it left a vacuum that made the next siren feel sharper. Along major highways, families slept in cars or leaned against guardrails, waiting for traffic to thin. A few tried to walk toward distant exits, flashlights held tight to their sides. The smell of hot asphalt mixed with exhaust from idling trucks, the scent drifting low across the road like a veil. In several cities, people reported a rumble overhead, deep, drawn out, heavy. Some shouted that it was another strike. Others recognized the pattern of military aircraft pivoting north. The lack of official statements made the sound larger than it was, stretching fear across entire districts. Toward midnight, a faint signal broke into the national emergency bands. It repeated 3 times, each version more distorted. Additional strikes possible. The words felt submerged, traveling through layers of interference, but they carried. Doors latched. Lights shut off. Conversations dropped to whispers. The country moved into its first full night not with noise, but with a single held breath. The second day began under a sky that looked bruised, as if the night had pressed too hard on it. Control, whatever was left of it, slipped into gaps no one could fill. Washington flickered awake block by block, small pockets of electricity returning with a faint buzz. The moment lights came on, televisions, Reuters, and radios surged at once, overloading circuits already strained. Screens froze. Signals collapsed. People stared at the sudden blackouts as if struck again. In Baltimore, a low haze drifted between row houses. A 62-year-old man stood outside with a radio pressed to his ear. The static cracked, then delivered only one phrase, "Incident in Norfolk." It was enough to pull neighbors into the street. Word spread faster than confirmation. A new fire at the naval supply site, another plume rising along the docks. For many, it meant only one thing: attacks restarting. Farther west, in Sacramento, sharp explosions rolled across early morning air. Gas lines damaged the previous day finally gave way, sending fire into the sky above industrial blocks. Windows trembled miles away. People ran outside, then froze in the same instant, confused by the direction of the sound. For several minutes, the city moved like a disrupted tide, waves of residents leaving homes, then rushing back inside as sirens rose without context. Across Virginia, the Norfolk blaze sent up a thick vertical column, darkening the already muted dawn. The fire was localized, but no one believed that. Groups gathered at intersections, exchanging rumors, checking the sky. The smell of smoke drifted across neighborhoods still raw from the earlier strike. Local emergency operations centers ran on generators, their rooms thick with heat and diesel fumes. Staff moved between paper maps and half-functioning monitors. Messages arrived out of order, some from FEMA channels advising caution, others from DHS without timestamps. Between transmissions lay long pockets of silence that felt intentional. Exhaustion settled into the halls like dust. Over Texas, the stillness broke. Air defense systems near Lackland AFB tracked an unidentified object moving fast and low. When interceptors reached it, the sky lit in a brief, white burst, too bright to ignore, too quick to interpret. Civilians across San Antonio heard the shockwave and dropped instinctively. Some sprinted into storm shelters. Others lay flat on living room floors. Radios near the base cut to emergency tones, then went dead. From above, the country looked unsettled. Thin trails of smoke along both coasts, fragments of light pulsing through half-functioning grids, aircraft weaving steady routes across the continent without pause. The air carried a low, constant hum from military corridors. In the background of almost every transmission came the same fractured lines: unconfirmed strike, assessment pending. In Minneapolis, a 70-year-old couple opened a metal trunk untouched for decades. Inside were relics from the Cold War: masks, iodine tablets, a hand crank siren. They set everything on the carpet without speaking. The husband wound the small radio, trying to catch something clearer than static. On bridges over the Mississippi, walkers formed narrow columns, neighbors checking on one another, passing information, sorting truth from rumor. The river moved slowly beneath them, its surface reflecting the broken lights of cities that breathed in unsteady rhythm. Some districts dimmed intentionally, others shut down as a defensive instinct, entire blocks choosing darkness because light felt like exposure. In western suburbs, a 50-year-old woman handed bottles of water to neighbors clustered in her driveway. She whispered, "It won't happen again, right?" But no one answered. Everyone kept glancing east, as though danger traveled with the sunrise. Then the radios snapped with a new noise, a sharp, clean transmission slicing through the static. Unidentified launches detected. The phrase landed like a weight across every street, hallway, and shelter. Conversations stopped. Cars halted mid-turn. The country stiffened in collective silence. For a moment, even the wind felt still. Dawn broke without warmth. Light fell over New Jersey and Pennsylvania in thin, washed-out layers, revealing streets where people moved as if sound itself were dangerous. Every noise carried weight. A dropped can, a closing door, the distant thud of a truck tailgate, each made clusters of neighbors tense, listening for patterns they feared to recognize. Near Pittsburgh, families gathered in basements and school shelters that smelled of dust, plastic mats, and old ventilation. A 45-year-old father held his children's hands while a battery lantern hummed overhead. Every few minutes someone asked if the sky looked clear. No one opened the door long enough to know. Along I-80, traffic was a frozen spine across the state, hundreds of vehicles abandoned or idling in place. A 58-year-old truck driver stood outside his cab, arms crossed against the cold, listening to a radio that offered only clipped warnings and weather updates from hours earlier. Around him, people waited without speaking. In New Jersey, an elderly woman sat on the steps of her basement, radio pressed to her chest more than to her ear. The signal drifted in and out, delivering fragmented sentences: maintain shelter, avoid unnecessary travel. The words repeated so often they lost meaning, becoming more rhythm than guidance. The first shock of the day rose from California, an explosion near March Air Reserve Base. A dense column of smoke pushed upward, visible for miles. Phones lit with unverified alerts. Residents stopped mid-errand, staring west. certain it marked a new wave of strikes. Some shelters refilled within minutes, doors slamming behind groups who had just stepped out for air. Over the southern states, GPS signals wavered, then failed entirely. Aircraft rerouted in cautious arcs. Pilots reported unreliable coordinates, and those reports leaked to civilians as half-formed rumors about attacks on airports. Gas stations filled with people who simply stood, waiting for instructions that never arrived. In Colorado, the day cracked open a second time. Air defense systems near the strategic facilities outside Colorado Springs intercepted 2 drones, one destroyed in the air, the other spiraling into a canyon. The echo rolled through the foothills like a slow drumbeat. Entire neighborhoods ducked into basements again, though no official order had been issued. Across the country, cities looked like scattered archipelagos, pockets of half-light surrounded by broad regions of dim silence. Stadiums, parking garages, and church lots became gathering points where people exchanged the few facts they had. Televisions in stores played old broadcasts on loop, emergency tests replacing missing anchors. Supermarkets stood nearly empty. Shelves were bare, yet people still walked the aisles out of habit, as if checking the absence itself meant something. On the streets, groups moved together in slow, deliberate steps. Every sound felt magnified: the hiss of air vents in shelters, the faint whir of battery fans, the low rumble of jets far overhead. Then a dull, distant thud crossed several states at once, too soft to classify, too broad to ignore. Conversations broke mid-sentence. Hundreds of cities paused in the same heartbeat. The country inhaled sharply and held the breath, waiting for whatever came next. Night settled again, heavier than the one before. Across the Midwest and Northern Plains, darkness felt dense, almost textured, as if the air itself carried the weight of the last 2 days. Lights were scarce, isolated windows, a few headlamps, the glow of sheltered basements. Everything else was muted. Even the wind sounded cautious. In North Dakota, the quiet broke first. A low boom rolled across farmland near an Air Force storage site, shaking thin walls and rattling dishes. A 66-year-old farmer sat in his hallway, towel clutched to his knees like a childhood blanket. He didn't move until the tremor faded. Neighbors stepped out onto porches, then retreated just as quickly, unsure whether the sound marked an accident, a strike, or something in between. Far to the northwest, a disruption hit Alaska's missile defense radar network. It wasn't loud, but its effects rippled through command channels, thinning what little communication remained. Civilian radios caught only faint, shredded fragments, limited capacity, continuing assessment. Most people didn't hear the words, just the tone beneath them, tight and strained. In Kansas, the sky lit briefly after midnight. A bright flash, then a descending ember that vanished behind low hills. Air defense units later confirmed an unidentified object had been neutralized. Civilians knew none of the details. They saw only the glow and heard the short, rolling echo that followed. Families who had begun to relax tightened their routines again. Lights off, doors locked, radios checked and rechecked. Cities across the country moved less. Streets that once buzzed with restless motion were now almost still. In Detroit, entire blocks sat in darkness. Residents gathered in living rooms with blankets and flashlights, speaking only when necessary. In Seattle, a 47-year-old IT worker listened to bursts of static on his emergency radio, telling himself that the lack of updates was better than the alternative. The hiss of the speaker sounded like breathing. In Atlanta, a 53-year-old nurse handed out the last of her medications to neighbors in an apartment hallway. The generator downstairs coughed every few minutes, threatening to quit. She kept her voice low, explaining doses by touchlight while children leaned against the wall, eyes wide and silent. Across countless towns, people moved through small rituals, checking water, tightening window coverings, turning off unnecessary lights, adjusting blankets, scanning the sky through narrow gaps. No one expected instructions anymore. Waiting had become a posture, a habit that required little energy and offered no comfort. From above, the nation resembled a scattered archipelago of faint lights across a darkened continent. Forests looked like black oceans. High-altitude aircraft crossed those expanses with steady, distant vibrations that drifted down like warnings without words. Inside basements and garages, the air held the smell of dust, concrete, and damp fabric. People whispered only when needed. Radios crackled, batteries ticked softly, and the faint hum of distant engines slipped through walls. The stillness felt less like peace and more like a held breath stretching across time zones. Near the 48th hour, a new voice entered the radio bands, clearer than any in the last day. Neutral tone, steady pacing. Just one line. The situation is changing. Then silence. Heavy. Total. In that pause, it felt as though the entire country leaned forward, not in fear, but in recognition that whatever came next would define the hours that followed.